Tim Dornan, who's a researcher in medical education at Belfast. Could you tell us who you are and how you got to where you are?
Yes, I mean, I suppose I always like to start at the beginning, which is that I am half Irish. My father was a medical graduate from the university where I now have an emeritus position. And he was one of 7 siblings, and quite extraordinarily, 6 of them were medical graduates from Queen's University, Belfast. There wasn't enough work for the number of doctors that were being educated in Ireland at that time, both the Republic and the North of Ireland. And so my father, one of the Sibship, because Northern Irish people are very clannish, one of the Sibship got a job in Sheffield in England and said, hey, consider coming over and working here. And one by one, the rest of the medical family, bar one, moved to the same area. So I was actually brought up in an expatriate Northern Irish Presbyterian, quite close family in England, though notably the youngest sibling stayed around in Northern Ireland and was a GP in the Shankill Road, which was a trouble spot in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So the connections retained, but in a sense it's not coincidental that I have this Irish background, because what I've discovered since I recently worked in Northern Ireland is that both medicine and education are held in very high esteem in the Northern Irish culture. And I think that my origins are very firmly rooted in the place where I've had the fortune to work in later years. But I lived, as it were, on the premises of a general practitioner's surgery, which was the family firm, as it were, in England, in a relatively not particularly affluent area of England. And from my earliest moments, medicine was an assumption, not a choice. And that I used to sit in my father's car when he did his visits. I used to listen to him and his brother talking over medicine when they had tea at the end of the morning surgery. And then I'm one of 3 siblings. And so first my brother went to study medicine in Sheffield. Later, my sister did as a second career, and it was never a choice for me. So I'll try and sort of fast forward a bit. I went to Cambridge University to study medicine, and I found it a very unrewarding experience, because Cambridge was great. So there was wonderful, the humanities, the whole ethos of Cambridge was fantastic, but the medicine was quite bizarre, because I was enlisted for a medical sciences degree, and my God, did they mean that in Cambridge. So the only patient I ever saw was either in the dissecting room or in a mortuary during the 3 years in Cambridge. And actually, I think that the seeds of this conversation were laid in a very ironic way, because during the 3 years in Cambridge, when you did your part 2, you could choose what subject you wanted to do. And having got fairly low grades in medical sciences, because I simply don't have a retentive memory, I'm just not a rote learner, which is what actually a lot of early medical education is. I thought, well, to hell with it, I'll do history and philosophy of science for my final degree. And I'm quite sure that I got more out of studying history and philosophy of science that has been useful in later years than out of studying medicine in Cambridge, because it was all about how the body's hardwired, and how the various pumps and things work. But actually the teachers were all researchers who wanted to push forward the boundaries in how the body's wired, but didn't give a toss about patients. And that felt very strange to me, because I had really been brought up to believe that medicine was a sort of social endeavor. Of course, I shouldn't romanticize it, because you know, particularly British society was by no means egalitarian in those days, and professionals were very aware that they were professionals and were, as it were, a cut above. But nevertheless, the mission of medicine, what it was there for, was very clearly, actually, it was quite closely related to the Christian faith, which I no longer hold. I'm an atheist, but there was in a sense, a spiritual dimension of it. So I did a medical sciences degree in Cambridge, and the way it works there is you can't, or you couldn't then do clinical training in Cambridge. You had to go somewhere else. Most people went to the London teaching hospitals, but there was the possibility of moving across to Oxford. And there was a girl who I was very fond of, who applied for the Oxford Medical School, and I wasn't a person who ever sort of made carefully considered choices. So, oh, hey, in for a penny, in for a pound, I'll apply for Oxford. And the irony of it was that I got in and she didn't. But this was completely foundational as far as I was concerned, because I appreciate that people who view this video won't be steeped in medical history, but you know, apart from Hippocrates, who founded the ethic of medicine, probably the most influential person who's ever really existed in the medical profession was Sir William Osler, who was professor of medicine we're talking at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. But he was professor of medicine first at McGill in Montreal, then in Philadelphia, and late in his career he was headhunted to be professor of medicine in Oxford University, because by then he'd written a textbook which had made him a legend internationally, and he was well known for his humanity. And in particular, the thing that distinguished him was the warmth and respect he showed towards medical students. So quite by accident, really, I ended up in Oxford, which was on the one hand very invested in clinical science, but actually cared a lot about students. And we were a fairly small group of students apprenticed to clinicians who were outstandingly good. I mean, not all of them, again, I shouldn't romanticize it, but I saw amazingly humane, but specialist and scientifically informed practice. And this sort of set the mold for me. And like many of my career non-choices, it was where the wind blew me that took me next. But I got married to a fellow student. She was hoping to pursue a career in pediatrics. So in those days, you tended to move between jobs. Oxford had far more people wanting jobs than there were jobs. So we didn't compete for jobs in Oxford, certainly when we qualified. And so we had to find jobs in the same place. And we found 3 cities beginning with the letter N, which seemed to offer interesting possibilities, one of which was Nottingham. And I was the first one to go for an interview and get a job. And it was a very strange job, but it involved 6 months working for, this would be the first, so having done house jobs, this would be the first postgraduate job beyond house jobs, which would be, I suppose, somewhere between early internship and residency. But as a senior house officer, this is really the beginning of serious residency, you normally get a fairly general exposure. But I got a job which was 6 months working for one specialist in diabetes, and then 6 months working for another specialist in diabetes. And one of the 2 specialists was somebody who later became really globally influential. He was very young then, in diabetes as the pursuit of patient benefit. Again, not in a romantic way, but his practice was very person-centered, and everybody who worked with and for him both became diabetes doctors and did so with a very strong person-centered emphasis. So I then actually returned to Oxford and did a research degree there, but it was actually a clinical trial that I ran, and I was put in charge of a cohort of people with diabetes, where my job was to help them optimize their blood glucose control. Then I ended up training as a specialist in diabetes, endocrinology, internal medicine.
Particular things, aren't there, about treating diabetes, which make it so much of an art, so intractable
Yes.
to sort of formulaic or checklist kind of approaches. So immersed in the best treatment of diabetes must have been a big influence on your approach to medical science.
Yes, I mean, it's not coincidental, because when insulin was discovered, we're just at the centenary of the discovery of insulin. It was it took a while before people learned how to delay its absorption. So you had to have multiple shots of insulin a day. And so right from the beginning, Elliot Jocelyn in Boston in the States came out with the aphorism that diabetes is the disease where the patient has to be their own doctor. And in the UK, Robin Lawrence, who nearly died, but his life was saved by the discovery of insulin, was a doctor. And so from the very beginning, the profession was led by people who had to be their own doctors and who made it their mission to help people with diabetes do that. You couldn't treat yourself with insulin in those days without a great degree of self-reliance.
I've always had an interest, Tim, in the specific kind of knowledge that is developed by self-help groups as opposed to the specialist professional knowledge. Have you developed any insights to self-help knowledge as a type of knowledge in your work?
Well, we're in danger of fast forwarding to activity theory here, Andy. But when you talk about self-help groups, there is a whole politics of self-help. And there are, of course, very highly developed self-help groups within the diabetes world. But the extent to which they represent the person with diabetes who's not politically active in self-help is very open to debate. In fact, again, from the very beginning, it was the norm for trainees in diabetes, and this differed from, as far as I know, any other certainly specialty in medicine. The norm was for us to go and meet the local branch of Diabetes UK, to meet patients, to talk to them. But there is a difference between that and, if you excuse me, small p political dimension, because I mean, it's partly because self-help groups can be lonely hearts clubs. I don't want to sound patronizing, but they can attract people for whom the self-help group is almost an end in itself. But actually, what I think is more important, and this is what I think was so special about diabetes, was that it was a very inclusive notion of the patient being a very important person in the diabetes community. The other thing about it was that it was also very interprofessional, so that when I was training for the first time, diabetes specialist nursing was becoming a discipline. Dietetics had been very important for a long time. And so actually podiatry, dietetics, nursing have all got very special skills to offer, also surgery, for example, for diabetic foot disease. So it is, well, I suppose I experienced it as potentially a very democratic disease. So excuse me if my take on self-help might have seemed a little bit negative. But in a sense, where the action is in the meeting with the person with diabetes in the context of caring. And I think that's what the essence of it is for me. But actually, there are, I think, in all over the place, in countries, there will be national bodies that are jointly constituted by people with diabetes and professionals and laboratory scientists.
There's a general lesson here, isn't there? That the patient groups develop a certain kind of medical knowledge, but it's limited, of course, by the fact that they're amateurs, so to speak. On the other hand, the professional groups are limited in a number of factors. One, they don't have the disease. Two, the division of the professions into silos. And the answer you've just given it is that the best form of medicine is the collaboration between the different forms of knowledge. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you entirely. It was just the only reason I was the best types of knowledge, because it's actually a more human collaboration in a sense, because and I
assume
suppose
that knowledge is something that's a facet of human activity. You're quite right. You should emphasize the relations between people and what they do rather than an idea of something in the head. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose to just develop that a teeny bit further, a colleague of mine has just had an article provisionally accepted for publication, but it's about basically how doctors can relate well to children, not in the context of diabetes in general. And one of the reviewers took issue of the fact that she'd suggested that the doctor should relate to the child in a friendship sort of relationship. And one of the reviewers said, oh, it's fraught with difficulties forming friendships. You know, just think what will happen when they have to move on to the adult clinic and the friendship severed and so on. But I think that's, in a sense, misses the whole point of medicine, because it's something about the point where our fallibilities meet, and that things like the forward trajectory of somebody's illness is you'd handle like you'd handle the parting with a friend. So I think I mean, I'm getting a bit away from the topic perhaps, but I think it's very important not to think of it solely as being something codified. And I mean, for example, there is a lot of interest in embodiment and gesture as symbol in medical practice. So, for example, in surgical education, there's wonderful work using the discipline of social semiotics to the way that the surgeon's hands are a very important part of the interaction between surgeon and patient. A colleague of mine has done a completely wonderful PhD about touch in medicine, and I was speaking to her yesterday, and she's moving on to other senses and talking about how do we use smell, for example. So I think it's very important that we think actually a little bit even beyond semiotics to other forms of interpersonal communication in medicine. Basically, that was my background. I got a job as a specialist doctor in Manchester, which is a wonderful place. It was the birth of the Industrial Revolution. It was the birth of trade unionism, very important place in the history of socialism. There's a statue of Engels.
And the birth of the Chartist movement as well.
Absolutely.
First working class party in history.
I think I'm right in saying that Marx and Engels met on the Crescent in Salford. And in the awful era of populism we're in now, we are, in a sense, we have the city corporation remains socialist. So it's a sort of socialist enclave in the country that's gone badly wrong, but I digress. I went to work in a hospital which was in actually a disadvantaged part of the city of Manchester, very affluent areas, but this is in the area where the people who dug the Manchester Ship Canal, who were people who were driven there by famine in Ireland. So they went there, they dug the Manchester Ship Canal, many of them died, this would be in the late 19th century, and they settled in the area of Salford. And so there's a very interesting sort of, well, indigenous, actually strongly Irish, third generation group of quite poor people, and a very interesting population to work with. And the hospital I went to was really in the most appalling state of disrepair, and it had relatively recently become an academic hospital. But I had the extraordinary good fortune that there was an energy amongst the docs there, well, the staff there, that just created the most extraordinary possibilities. In particular, the two foundation chairs of medicine and surgery both became hugely influential national leaders. and were very, very good clinicians. So I found myself in a place where the clinical practice was very good, but there was a lot to be done. And really the journey into chat began when the University of Manchester, one of the students did a survey which showed that 25% of graduating students wouldn't recommend another student to study medicine in Manchester. So the dean decided something should be done. And I think that from everything I've seen internationally and nationally, and as times unfolded, I think I was part of a pretty unique experiment where at the level of dean and backed up by some of the most influential senior academics in a big research intensive university, they said, we are going to transform the undergraduate medical curriculum and in a sense make it more democratic. That's not how it had been spoken about, but broadly speaking,
what year are we talking about there, Tim?
We're talking about, well, in the 1990s, there was a short period when the regulator, the General Medical Council in the UK, they published an amazing document called Tomorrow's Doctors, which was a mandate for really revolutionary change.
Well, I asked that because the medical faculty at Melbourne Uni, which is where I was working, had that revolutionary transformation of medical training during the 1990s as well. And whenever I'm in the hospital and I talk to a young doctor, I say, hey, were you one of the PBL kids, problem-based learning kids, you know?
I mean, actually,
the
origins of PBL are very interesting. I mean, we're still a long way away from activity theory, but I think we are in the heart of the value system of activity theory here, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. But actually, the origins of problem-based learning were that it was really, I think the place that would claim that it originated from is the McMaster University in Canada, which was a young disruptive institution where somebody called Norman Barrows hit on the idea of getting students to learn problem-solving skills by treating knowledge or patients or whatever else as problematic situations. Turns out that was on a false premise because reasoning skills are not transferable, but it is a very good way of engendering curiosity. But the place that picked up PBL was Maastricht University in the Netherlands, where there was the coal mining industry collapsed in the province of Limburg in the south of the Netherlands. And there was huge unemployment, and the Dutch government decided that they would create a new university which would bring in employment but should be radical. And there was a doctor there who really grasped the nettle, and Maastricht University set out to I'm sorry, I'm using the word democratize quite a bit, but I think that that's what I think the mission was. And in fact, an international coalition was formed of medical schools, which was very much orientated towards moving medicine out from the ivory towers and very much engaging with real communities of real sick people in not so prosperous countries. So problem-based learning had a specific mission to revolutionize medical education, and it completely changed the relationship between teacher and student. And that was problematic because in discussion groups, to have teachers facilitator asking questions and chipping in knowledge, as it were, at the invitation of students is one thing, but to have a surgeon in an operating theatre treating the student as equal, if I could sort of parody it that way, is problematic because their power is not evenly distributed. And this was one of the reasons why the problem-based learning sort of revolution was problematic. In point of fact, I think we pretty successfully addressed that, because I was put in charge of medical student education in a large hospital in a university which was undergoing a very pro-social reform in its medical education. And I was able to galvanize the entire medical workforce of this hospital to, well, yes, to embrace a new approach to medical education. And it was very interesting because it was devil take the hindmost. And those who had conservative attitudes and wanted to teach students as they'd always done, you know, by humiliation, all that sort of stuff, got left behind. And those who were prepared to embrace the opportunities created by the new medical education galloped ahead. So disciplines that had not had a place in the medical curriculum, but which had something to offer, notably anesthetics and intensive care, where students might get a 1-week anesthetic placement in the old curriculum. With an integrated program, they became absolutely mainstream because they're expert clinical physiologists, so that it potentially led to a huge reassortment of the ways in which the skills base of the medical profession can be used for learning. Now, actually, what happened was, because the interesting thing is why there was a revolution in the 90s and why it petered out. And I don't think there's very much doubt about why it petered out, and that is because the Institute of Medicine report, To Err is Human, was published just around the millennium. And at the same time in the UK, there was a huge public scandal over heart surgeons operating beyond their competence and causing the death of children. And this triggered a sharp turn to the right in medicine and education. And it's, if you look at the UK regulator, I examined a wonderful PhD where somebody had actually discourse analyzed all their successive pronouncements about what medical education could be, and you could see a politically driven complete turn in the nature of medical knowledge, which followed the if you like, the realization that medicine wasn't all good and could cause harm. And this created a huge backlash, which put the medical profession on the back foot, and education went belly up from then onwards, in my opinion.
So if I understand it correctly, this meant a sudden move to counting how many adverse outcomes there were and trying to reduce that to zero. That's how I've sort of understood it.
Yes, I mean, I think that you know, the arguments have become more sophisticated now, but the argument was, well, if the airline industry can improve safety, why can't medicine? Well, in a sense, you could ask that question in the United States, where medicine is driven by profit, but actually in the UK, where there is no profit incentive, and it's under-resourced and understaffed, the analogy is, well, fine, show me what the safety industry of the airline industry would be if every plane had to take off in a hurricane with only one pilot on the flight deck and twice as many passengers as there are seats. What would the safety record look like then? So actually medicine was assaulted with very simplistic argument that denied its complexity. So the inherent complexity of medicine, which is where I think activity theory is hugely important, because it embraces complexity, whereas the last 20 years of competence-based medical education have denied complexity. And by doing that, by imposing simplistic solutions on complex problems, in the UK have actually compromised safety in the name of safety.
Now, Tim, you've got to tell us what competence-based medicine means.
Well, its origins were from Ralph Tyler in the US in the 1960s. So the origins of this idea came from behaviorist psychology, and it was given a huge political boost after the launch of Sputnik. So it actually has political origins. Within a year or so of the launch of Sputnik, there was federal legislation in the US to overhaul the education system to get the US back in the space race. And they introduced what was called, well, I've forgotten what it was called then, but the emphasis was all on learning outcomes, measurable learning outcomes. And the irony of it is that, as I understand it, there's a good article describing this history by Hodge. As I understand it, this was eventually deemed to be a failed experiment, but at around that time, the medical profession hit on the idea it was logical to define performance-based outcomes. And so the solution that was brought in when the medical profession was on the back foot would say, fine, well, a doctor is simply a set of outcomes amalgamated into, happens to be a human being, and that as long as you define the outcomes, train them and measure them, then you'll improve patient safety.
What's wrong with that?
It doesn't work.
Explain.
It denies it. It's fundamentally flawed because, of course, there are some repetitive tasks you do in medicine which are trainable and which deviate from a norm within narrow tolerances, and that would, for example, be that which can be learned with surgical simulation for example, endoscopic. I mean, I'm not a surgeon, but there are good instances of where, without doubt, simulation type training and reaching competence is akin to reaching competence on a flight simulator. And then, but the question, first of all, is, does the medical profession actually deal with the transfer from simulation to reality? And the really crunch question is, how similar is most medical practice to anything that's simulatable? And the moment you allow patients and indeed doctors to be human beings rather than robots, medicine becomes a very non-standard practice.
I interrupted you. You're, I think, talking about the development of medical thinking when you got to competence-based medicine. Continue the story from there.
Well, I suppose this is in a sense where my personal history comes in, because it was antithetical to everything I believed medicine was, and indeed antithetical to my experience of bringing in a medical education which tries to account for human variation rather than human standardization, which is what I think PBL was. And I had done a lot of work developing patient-based education in ways that acknowledge the individuality of the student and of the patient. And then the cold wind of standardization blew in, because PBL was emphatically not about standardization. But the question you have to ask was, why did it have such a short period of currency? Because it had quite a long period of currency in a limited number of settings when originally disseminated, particularly from Maastricht. And it was embraced. I mean, okay, it was in a sense a somewhat neo-colonial project, but it was embraced. And then it began to spread like wildfire, and it very quickly came to be viewed as not a good thing to do. And I personally, I mean, I haven't thoroughly researched the history of this, but my lived experience of it was that the whole social discourse about doctors changed, and that education was, if you like, medicine's attempt to retain its social influence and power by saying, fine, doctors are unsafe, we'll fix it. But the political leaders knew very little about human learning and adopted very avidly solutions that work in a very limited number of clinical settings.
So, Tim, take us to activity theory, how you came to it and what its contribution is.
Well, I came to it through my friendship with Alan Bleakley, whose name may or may not be known to you and viewers, but he's a polymath who works in the field of medical education in the UK, who, so that was really one of my influences. Alan's been a huge positive influence on me. But perhaps the thing that really got me into it was that as the cold wind was blowing through medical education in the University of Manchester, I began to become a bit of a pariah in the medical school, because I wasn't just cranking through students trying to improve the national student satisfaction score. And so I ended up in the bosom of the School of Education socio-cultural group. And I'd become familiar with Wenger's work because I did a PhD. I did a second research doctorate mid-career to become a doctorally trained education researcher. I'd used Wenger's work, and to my amazement, I found Etienne Wenger was actually a visiting professor in Manchester. So there was a group with which you're acquainted, Andy, through Julian Williams, who's an absolutely inspirational scholar of Vygotsky and Leontiev. And so I, in a sense, brought medicine into the discussions of a discussion group whose three main interests were activity theory, communities of practice, and latterly figured worlds. So I developed this, I had this extraordinary privilege of becoming somewhat versed in the principles of activity theory and other sociocultural theories from people who knew it much more deeply than I could ever do. But I suppose the thing that really appealed to me was that I'd always, throughout my life, seen education as being, and from my personal experience as well as seeing it enacted, as something with huge potential to abuse power. So it felt completely right to me to be in a group where the way in which the potential that exists in people in society was viewed as problematic, particularly the way that power could be appropriated and abused. And in my opinion, that's what has become problematic for the medical profession, because people who know very little about learning have empowered themselves and in their own way sustained the power of the profession by putting about very, very ill thought out solutions. And activity theory.
Quite intrigued, Tim, that activity theory brought you to like critique of power within the profession.
No, I think it's perhaps the other way around.
Right.
It gave a language. But I mean, I had no idea about critical theory. I did, grounded theory, thematic analysis sort of stuff. And to find that you could look at language and see the way language was the exercise of influence, the sharing or the non-sharing of social goods was a very powerful revelation to me. So I think perhaps the thing that really got me going was discourse.
So tell us about more about how you have used activity theory in your own work.
I think actually, Andy, that I realize I've said an awful lot about possibly not very much, but coming to activity theory, I think there's an article I've published which does really exemplify the tensions that I've described, which is in the journal Medical Teacher, first author Gillespie. I'm a co-author, but it's a worked example of how the competence movement introduced contradictions that demonstrably were doing more harm than good. Not everybody would agree with me, but so basically, I got very interested in prescribing. So the UK regulator of medical education put out for tender a project in about 2007. I was an ambitious leader of a young research group. We tendered, we got the tender, and we did a study which was designed to find out why newly qualified doctors so often make errors in prescriptions, because people spend 5 years in medical school and nearly 10% of the prescriptions they write have errors in them. Why is this?
You would think, wouldn't you, that prescriptions would be the first thing a new young doctor would be able to get right.
Well, you would, until you begin to critique the notion of prescription error and indeed medical practice. But this was a huge political hot potato. So the regulator commissioned us to do research. And what we showed was that it was all about context, not about the individual prescriber. And so that actually medical schools were doing a reasonably good job, but you can't learn the job out of context, which is the dominant assumption of competence-based medical education. They assume that prescribing is a transferable skills, but that's a denial of context. And everything we know is that error in complex safety critical practice arises in context. I mean, the airline industry knew that very well after the Tenerife accident. Largest number of fatalities in civil aviation. But it doesn't suit neoliberal people to acknowledge the effect of context, because what they're after is, and here we begin to come to contradictions in activity theory, what they're after is the exchange value of saying, we've ensured the medical profession is safe because I can show you the numbers of how they performed in our tests. And what we demonstrated was that, and I mean, Angstrom talks about navigating situations to handle their fragile identities. I mean, that's not an accurate quote, but that's precisely what happens with young doctors. And so that actually when they begin to take responsibility for practice, certainly in the UK with totally inadequate supervision, they have very fragile identities and will be very strongly influenced by contextual influences, particularly the inherent tensions between the nursing and medical professions. So we demonstrated very clearly in what's been described as a seminal report, it's called the EQUIP study, we demonstrated very clearly in work commissioned by the regulator that it was really context that caused the problem. But what they did in response was counterintuitive, but explicable because of neoliberal politics, and that is they introduced an off-the-job competence assessment, which we had already shown in research, which they paid for, wasn't going to make things better.
Context is the problem. I'll tell you what, we'll take away the context.
Exactly. So I, did this piece of research and then discovered it wouldn't let go of me because people cited it so much. I was embarrassed about that because whilst I was the first author, it was actually a wonderful colleague, Mary Tully, and Darren Ashcroft, pharmacists, who really did the hard work in it. But then I realized that, hey, we've got the most wonderful research model, because here's the thing that defies medicine being a simple, regulatable, competence-based practice. Because actually you simply cannot, and in my research, I chose prescribing insulin for patients in hospital, which is very largely delegated to young doctors who are completely wet behind the ears. And one of the reasons it's delegated to them is because nobody else would dare do it, because it's so bloody difficult.
The interns to the lions, eh?
Yes, and it's within a very narrow therapeutic window, so you can very easily give too much. If you try to avoid giving too much, you can give too little, and that's delegated to the most junior doctors. Now, what we have published is a critique of the competence approach to prescribing and showed that it introduced a very serious contradiction, because it made it more logical for students not to gain experience in practice before qualification, because they had to demonstrate their exchange value out of practice on the assumption that that which was exchangeable would be useful. So we went from having relatively inexperienced young doctors to having totally inexperienced young doctors because they were busy satisfying the regulator rather than becoming useful. There is a test called the OSCE, you may have heard of, which stands for the Objective Structured Clinical Examination. And this, like the competence movements and simulation, spread like wildfire because it meant you could do an off-the-job simulated test of competence. So rather than going through 5 years of medicine to be able to be of service to patients, which would be useful, you go through 5 years of medicine to pass the final OSCE. So for a medical student, if what you want to do is to be useful to patients, gaining experience of the messiness of practice is appropriate. If you're going to be tested in a non-messy OSCE, being in the messiness of practice is a waste of time because you should be rehearsing for the competence test.
Teaching
so
for the
you
test.
become more competent but less useful.
Yeah. Yeah, and isn't that an age-old story? The test defining the teaching practice. And if the test is ill-conceived, it just destroys the whole thing.
But the whole medical establishment internationally has swallowed this hook, line, and sinker. But I think the other thing that is in the Gillespie paper is that we made an intervention which we knew, and this is where we depart a little bit from the change laboratory approach, because Uriel Angestrom's change laboratory approach brings in, as it were, consultant change managers who do change labs. They get clinicians to spend gazillion hours off the job in change labs. But actually, we did something very different from that, which is to be agents of change, knowing what we thought would make a difference, being au fait with activity theory, but it meant we could simply drop a drop of water into the ocean, which brought about wholesale change. So the change we made was to give every medical student a purple pen, a pen that writes in purple ink, change the rules of prescribing so that medical students were allowed to write on real patients' charts rather than simulated charts, which allowed them to become part of the, I was going to say community of practice, but become part of the activity system of real practice rather than the activity system.
Purple pen, a way for others to see that it was a student that had done the writing.
Exactly. So simply the colour of the ink.
Safety measure, so to speak.
It's a safety measure. So the nurse was not allowed to administer the drug until a doctor had countersigned it in black. And actually the unintended positive consequences of this were a cascade, because now, rather than medical students being a nuisance, they were the nurse's best friend, because the medical student could get the doctor to sign a prescription when the nurse, the doctor said, stop bothering me. And the medical student's job was to do the bothering. So this is a wonderful
their life depended on it.
Of where you can get all of the benefits of complexity from activity theory, because you make a very small flap of a butterfly's wings and you get a tornado on the other side of the world, because you can analyze the contradictions. And there was never better time to do it, because the regulators have spent the last 20 years creating contradictions, and safety is no better.
It's wonderful, Tim. It's probably a good note to end on. I'll just tell you a little joke. At one particular juncture, Brazil had the same problem that Ireland had, that they were training too many doctors. And so there's a joke. This is background knowledge. There's a joke. A woman has got a washing machine breakdown. So she calls the plumber, and the plumber fixes it up and says, how much is that? Oh, that'll be $60. Says, oh, I could give you a hysterectomy for that as well if you like. So,
that's very good. No,
I've screwed up the punchline.
Excuse me for just ending by turning your joke into something serious. One of the most beautiful applications of activity theory in Change Lab that I've seen was done in Brazil. And so there is an article whose first author is Diniz, D-I-N-I-Z.
I know her, yes.
Who has done wonderful work with activity theory to improve the experiences of birthing mothers. So I'm sorry to sour your joke with a bit of seriousness, but